It's not controversial to say Breath of the Wild was a hotly anticipated game. It certainly was for me at the very least. I only got round to playing it a year and a bit after release. I'd heard a lot about it, despite trying to avoid as much information as possible. Some bad, but mostly overwhelmingly positive. So when the time came that I could no longer resist the temptation of the Switch, of course I set my sights on the latest Zelda. I also threw Mario Kart into the bundle, but that hasn't held my attention quite so much for a few reasons. Now, electronics are substantially cheaper in my native UK than in my country of residence, and as luck would have it, I was heading back there for a stag party around the same time, and staying with a friend. Said friend very kindly agreed for me to order my new Switch to arrive at his, so I could get playing as soon as possible, in between other, less wholesome activities. What followed was one of the latest and best incidents of pass and play co-op I've had since childhood. Moritz isn't much into games, but he took to it well. I think, while it seems technical from the outside, Zelda has always been designed to be accessible, something which is a net positive in my opinion. But then I've never played Skyward Sword, and I don't really think I want to. For Breath of the Wild, one of the obvious advantages of the freedom it offers is that the adventure progresses at a pace determined entirely by the player, an enticing gimmick, and a complete turnaround from the extreme hand-holding and pace-killing guidance of the last two mainline Zelda titles. Not to mention a welcome change. Even so, rather than overwhelm players by unleashing them on Hyrule with only their scats and a stick for protection, there is a tutorial area for players to get to grips with the controls and key concepts before setting out. In our excitement, we made two amusing mistakes early on. The first was missing this chest, which just happens to contain a simple set of clothes to wear. They don't offer much protection, but they allow Link some dignity as he starts his adventure. In our foolishness, we thought Nintendo had meant for you to start deprived. We assumed this was just the game's early attempt to establish a rugged survivalist tone, and although we found it hilarious, we were somewhat grateful to discover our first pair of trousers.
Hey, Hosen.
The second was somehow missing any and all melee weapons for the first two shrines. Obviously, it's initially hard to kill the bokoblins unarmed, in order to at least get the ball rolling on the weapon economy that the game has. We ended up skirting around the early enemies for half an hour or so, until we found our way to the first shrine and obtained the Magnesis power-up. With this, and the help of a few conspicuous metal boxes, we were able to fight our way through the shrine without any other weapons. In slightly misguided fanboy reverence, I assumed once again that this had been laid out on purpose, to get you accustomed to the Sheikah powers right out of the gate, not to mention encouraging out-of-the-box thinking. While I realise now this probably wasn't the most obvious way the designers imagined you getting through the first section of the game, the fact that it's possible is very impressive, and it makes a very early showcase of the freedom and the options you'll have available to you going forward. And, oh shit, I'm dead. You wanna go?
Yeah, sure, man. So Breath of the Wild was pretty much the most engrossing gaming experience I've had in the last 10 years. I'm not an avid gamer beyond the occasional FIFA match, but this just sucked me in. As a big fan of Studio Ghibli films, I felt immersed into the world of kind of Shinto magic, like roaming through the forests of Princess Mononoke or villages of Spirited Away. There was mystery and magic just behind the horizon. Playing this back and forth with Matt, exploring Hyrule and figuring out the mechanics and basics of the game, it took me back to childhood, roaming around a patch of forest, imagining spirits and trolls behind rocks and under logs, and just figuring it out as you go along. Without much advanced knowledge going into it, we were left to our own devices and intuition. With the mechanics of the Switch, I felt invited to play and experiment. While stuck in a shrine trying to figure out the next move, almost as a joke, I just swung my arms through the room, and I ended up bashing through the shrine's obstacle. Everything in the game felt intentional and worthwhile. The beautiful aesthetic just made you want to dive into every forest and pond, climb up high to take in the spectacular views, or because some magical cave may lie right behind that waterfall. And this aimless wandering and exploration was then rewarded with Koroks, popping up like the Kodama of Studio Ghibli lore, guiding the hero through the strange shit. It started raining. Alright, you're up again, Matt.
It's more than novelty that caused us to find the early hours of Breath of the Wild so engaging. It's a very well designed tutorial, showcasing a tight as hell microcosm of what the game will eventually become. There are obvious objectives and teaching points to find, but the game lets you tackle them how and when you want to. It's handing you a mandate to forge your own path, in the freaking tutorial. I also find it interesting that this is the only part of the game, except for the final dungeon and the path there, that is mandatory for completion, and therefore the only part that any percentage speedrunners bother with. I encourage anyone curious to watch a speedrun once you finish Breath of the Wild for the first time. Like most speedruns, it's a humbling experience. This means then that outside the plateau, all the content, the shrines, the divine beasts, the fairy fountains, etc. all exist just to help you prepare for your final confrontation, all technically optional content in the strictest sense. That being said, while setting up a climax and a sense of closure is important, I can't honestly say that the point of Breath of the Wild is this final battle, though I think on some level the designers want it to be. No, clearly the point is the freedom of exploration in this vast space, with the castle acting as a capstone. Very much about the journey sort of thing. Anyway, let's get to it. Off the plateau and the adventure can truly begin. We spent the next few days on and off exploring the enormity of Hyrule. We discovered Kakariko Village, named some horses. I wound up drowning a lot for some reason. But then, I had to leave, and much like Link, the cooperative part of my adventure was over. Not that stopped me playing like a maniac for the next month or more. I didn't know at the time, but most of the genuine childlike excitement of what Breath of the Wild had to offer was already behind me. Don't get me wrong, it's a great game, one I'd recommend to almost anyone. I was fortunate that the first time I got to see the Switch outputting to its admittedly modest full potential graphically was on a large HD TV during the first of these action movie sequences, trying to board one of the divine beasts, certainly a standout moment. Others included wandering across Eventide, or the Lost Woods, or one of the crazy large stone structures, all impressive and mostly hands-off set pieces. However, the absolute star of the show, unsurprisingly, is the landscape itself. Every corner of Hyrule feels like it was handcrafted. No procedural generation here, or at least it doesn't feel like it. Each individual rock formation, forest and body of water has a unique feeling and identity, while the methods of traversal allow for player expression. Facilitating this in a meticulously designed playground is something all but unique to Breath of the Wild's open world. We've come a long way since Skyrim's indistinguishable grey mountains and pine trees. By far my favourite part of the whole experience with regards to actual gameplay has to be finding these memories scattered all over the map. You're given just a photo, and using a combination of recall, observation, and a few clues if you get stuck, you have to head out into the wild and find it. For some reason, almost all of the story content is locked behind these puzzles. Player reaction to the cutscenes has been mixed at best, but personally, I like them. For reasons I still don't fully get, these scenes make me emotional every single time I watch them. Like, is it the music, or Zelda's shaky voice, or the emotive faces? On some level I find the minimalist and frankly simple story of failure, loss and attempted redemption really resonant. Don't know what to say, they work for me. Attaching an awesome recognition puzzle to this content was personally a very rewarding experience. Your mileage may and probably did vary, but for me this was an undeniable highlight. Breath of the Wild is a long game if you let it drag on, and eventually I was starting to feel like it was time. Fortunately, the assault on the castle is yet another highlight. Perhaps because, like the plateau, it's one of the only bits you have to see. It's a shame then, that after so much time preparing, the final boss was a bit of a pushover. Then there's an all but scripted battle sequence, then it's over. Roll credits. It was all just a bit anticlimactic. Like something was missing. Breath of the Wild is a fantastic game, but it's a little disappointing that nothing ever again reached the heights of the plateau. There are a number of reasons for this, but one of the most important is how few power-ups and new mechanics there are to find after the tutorial. Sure, finding the camera and its upgrade are nice, but they don't do much for Link's ability to survive in the wild. The other upgrades are a little underwhelming too. There's a distinct lack of new verbs after the tutorial, and I blame this in part for me slowly losing interest as the game went on. As many have noted, there are a couple of other frustrating mechanics to deal with. I'm not going to bother defending weapon degradation. It creates a few exciting oh shit moments, but it discourages even using the most interesting weapons. And in the late game it discourages engaging the enemies at all. I feel the system needs tweaking rather than being completely trashed though. Giving the more powerful weapons a lot more durability would have been a lot more fun in my opinion. What I will defend is the climbing. I like to think of it as a mini-game, or something even less complex. A microgame, if you will. The interaction between the stamina bar and the jump mechanic turns every climb into an exciting risk-reward. While losing time is never pleasant in games, it does create some stakes and a reason to take it seriously. What I mean is that having a constant source of gameplay tension means that every moment of traversal has the potential to be engaging. To a lesser extent, this occurs while gliding too, as you have to balance your stamina by alternating falling and gliding. This doesn't do much for travelling cross-country, however, even on horseback, and I find myself doing less and less of that as time went by. In very particular instances, the much maligned rain actually heightens this tension, for short climbs at least, as it's sometimes possible to outpace the amount you slip down by jumping. Other times, you're just stuck for a bit. Not ideal. I can't think of a good solution to the rain problem though, one that doesn't hurt the illusion created by the realistic weather and physics, but an unlockable power or Sheikah Slate upgrade would have mitigated some frustration. I suppose Rivali's Gale can be used to a limited extent. For me at least, the climbing added more than it took away. The lackluster dungeons are much harder to forgive. Obviously the problem isn't lack of content, as 120 shrines adds up to a lot of underground exploration. Dungeons in Zelda are so much more than just content though. They are pace setters, checkpoints of a sort. Sure, they were a concentration of puzzles and combat, but they were also an escalating part of the narrative, and distinct tableaus in the story unfolding. I accept that the restrictive order just doesn't mesh well with the freedom the designers wanted. For me, this would be the most important thing to fix in a sequel, and I hope the Nintendo elves are hard at work to find a way to retrofit proper dungeons back into the game structure they've created. On another note, while I can't hold this against the game, I have to accept that, as part of my experience of it, losing my travel companion also impacted my enjoyment to a small extent. For a game so delicately crafted as a solo adventure, it was strangely fun to discover mechanics together, to hear second-hand accounts of adventures, to return home to find your horses now had weird names. I recommend anyone in a position to do so to have a go, surrender a little control, and try sharing a game that wasn't made for it. You may find the experience more rewarding than you realise. Before playing Breath of the Wild, I was pretty certain I was done with open world games. Developers had begun throwing them into games that didn't really suit them, where the world just functioned as an elaborate, tedious menu for selecting missions. Breath of the Wild is a success not because it brought an open world design to Zelda, but because it captures the sense of what makes open world games enticing in the first place. The excitement of exploration, the faith that what lies over the next mountain is worth seeing. Personally, I haven't played an open world before or since that I enjoyed quite as much as Breath of the Wild. By far the most disappointing aspect of the whole thing is not being able to name your character. It was always a heartwarming surprise when a wise sage addresses you sincerely and with gravity as fuckface, or an innocent child is screaming "Bore liquor" at the top of his lungs. Alas, I'll pour one out to a casualty of the voice acting.